Hello and welcome back to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, we're breaking down the year in the comic book industry in two parts. In part one, we'll look at the state of the comic book industry as a whole, as well as what things were going on in society that may have impacted the comic book industry during that year. We'll talk big picture about what's going on at DC and independent comics, then we'll shift our focus to Marvel. We'll look at who is creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics debuted or ended. In part 2, we'll dive deep into Marvel's longest-running characters, Matt Murdock. We'll look at what the year had in store for the Man Without Fear, key things that happened, and who joined or left his world before spotlighting one key issue or story. From there, we'll wrap up the year's discussion with a takeaway before moving on to another year and a whole new discussion. We're excited to have you join us on a trip through comic book history. We are back with the start of another new year, 1997. My name is Dwayne, and with me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, how's it going?
It's going really well. Excited to get to talk about a slightly more compact year of comics, where we can maybe have a little bit of space to talk about some things without just having to have an avalanche. So it is a quiet week, really, in comic terms, though, because everything has gone completely to the dogs. There's a lot less happening in comics and in the Marvel Universe than there was ago. But I have to say, I was surprised to find that 1997 still did have some pretty great things going on under the surface, and I'm excited to talk about them.
Cool. So when you think about 1997 before you started researching, you're like, oh, there's not really that much there. But as you were researching and getting underneath the hood, as they say, you found some things of interest?
Well, it's just that the late 90s are a really tough time for comics. You know, it was a devastating time for shops. It was a tough time in terms of a lot of series ending and a lot of disruptions. And, you know, it's a weird time in some ways because a lot of the established creators have either gotten old and retired or have moved on to other industries. And you've got a lot of sort of up-and-comers who are unproven, or folks who didn't necessarily last a long time in the industry doing stuff. So yeah, I think I would say that of, if I had to have a pick of years to read all of the comics from, 97 would not have been high on my list as far as years I would pick.
All right. Well, I'm very interested in hearing where this discussion goes. So I guess without further ado, we should jump in and talk about the year in comics. The year in comics. All right, Dan, set the stage for us here. It's 1997. Marvel has just come off a disaster year where they ended up filing bankruptcy at the end of the year. There was a lot of turmoil outside of Marvel, though, in comics as a whole. Where do we start? What is the big picture for 1997?
The big picture is, essentially we start. You would set the stage by first noting that the theater is on fire, right?
Yes.
So that's kind of the main thing. But as harsh as 96 had been, 97, as near as I can tell, in most senses was even worse.
Really?
Sales continued to plummet. Marvel is now in the middle of this whole process of trying to dig out from a messy financial mess. And then other publishers are feeling the pain as well, as a lot of the problems caused by Marvel's not only lack of books coming out, but then also their lack of distribution because of all of the problems they've got with their attempt to do their own distribution company, has just caused money flow problems and sort of just confidence problems in the industry. So there's a lot less happening in comics than there was a few years ago, and we are back to that point where there are people talking, as though sort of like we'd had in the 50s and we'd had in the 70s. There's people asking, is this the end for American comic books?
Not great. If we're talking about being a fan of comics in 1997. All right, so DC and what's going on outside of Marvel. Where do we begin? What's noteworthy about what's going on outside of Marvel?
Well, the culturally, comic books still are trying to make their way out of the comic stores. And especially the folks at Image and a lot of the other publishers are really working to get sort of some deals in Hollywood and things like that. Everybody's still trying to be the next Batman, right? And it's been a while since we've had the first Batman. So there's a bunch of movies that come out again this year.
They want to be the first Batman. They don't want to necessarily be the most recent Batman, right?
So we have a Batman movie this year. We have Batman and Robin comes out.
Oh my goodness.
And Batman and Robin from 1997 is the Clooney, O'Donnell, Silverstone sort of bat nipples Batman.
Oh God.
With this is one where you had Arnold as Mr. Freeze and all that.
That's
sort of
right.
Stuff.
Right.
Is generally this is considered to be the Batman movie that killed Batman movies, right? And so there are some people now who have, in retrospect, kind of returned to it and enjoy it as camp and the like. But I think that on the surface, when it came out, most of us were pretty horrified by it. And so it did make a little bit of money, but it did not by any means do well. Didn't do well enough to get a sequel, essentially.
Right. And there were other movies this year too, right?
Yep. There were 3 of them with very differing levels of success. So starting at the bottom, we actually had really one of the most horrible comic book movies you can ever imagine. We had Steel, starring Shaquille O'Neal as as Steel, come out, and it bombed. It made almost no money. It's kind of fun just if you want to watch a train wreck of a movie. It's kind of a good time, but it did not make its budget back. We had Spawn, which comes out, and it actually does okay. This is Todd McFarlane's Spawn. They did 2 different things this year. Not only is there an animated series that starts on HBO this year, and which is pretty successful. It runs for 3 years, 3 seasons, and is a very dark sort of adult Spawn, right?
Uh-huh.
And then there's the movie which comes out, which is a little bit softer. And it does okay as well. It makes some money. Not enough that you're going to get a Spawn movie franchise, but it makes some money, so it does okay. And then you have kind of one of the weirdest things in terms of comic book, and that is that there's a comic book movie nobody knows is a comic book movie. Because Men in Black came out as a comic in 1990, was very, 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 like, not noticed by anybody. Nobody bought this comic. Nobody cared about it. But it got optioned somehow. Got made into this movie with Will Smith.
That was a juggernaut movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Multiple sequels and made a ton of money. So that is by far the most successful comic book movie of the year. And one of the more successful comic book franchises ever made. So
yeah,
of the non-Marvel DC ones, I'd say it probably is. I can't think of any others that would be bigger.
Yeah, Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones, Vincent D'Onofrio is in that as well. I remember really liking that movie.
Yeah, it's great. Just a fun, entertaining movie. D'Onofrio is fantastic in it, actually. So. But yeah, I would say that that's something that a lot of people just don't even realize is adapted out of a comic book. But
I don't think I did, and I definitely did not know it at the time when it came out. They weren't saying
didn't play it up at all.
Yeah, none in the marketing was saying that this was a comic book movie.
No, and in fact, I think I found it weird I think it was Universal. They have a Men in Black ride or a Men in Black exhibit type thing. And nowhere in it does it seem to show the comic books. So even Universal doesn't really focus on the fact that it's an adaptation or anything. It's played more as sort of an original property. So that's the movie side of things. That's sort of the the attempts to dip their toes outside of the comic shops. Inside comic shops, it was kind of a weird year. So we normally start with DC, right? How has DC been doing compared to Marvel the last decade or so? From what we've been talking about.
I mean, definitely they've been basically the second to Marvel, and like they've been trying to play catch up. It feels like, and they've had some scenarios where they blew up the universe and things like that did really well, but it still felt like they were still trying to catch up to what Marvel was doing.
DC was the juggernaut for most of the 50s and 60s. They were the ones who did superhero comics. And then Lee and Kirby came in, Ditko, all the rest of the guys, made the new Marvel universe. And Marvel originally was just sort of this little kid on the block. By the mid-70s, early to mid-70s, Marvel took over from DC as the top publisher. And it has kept that top publisher ranking every year since the early 70s until this year, when DC actually passed them for the first time with the top market position for the year in comic books. So Marvel's various foibles were actually significant enough that they fell out of first place this year. So DC had a bunch of stuff going on. They had a crossover called Genesis, and that actually was a big New Gods sort of universal danger sort of thing that went through the entire line. Superman, they wanted to make things a little weird with him again, so they actually turned him blue, essentially turned him into lightning. So he became like a being of pure energy, almost like a Legion's Firestorm type of thing. This was something that got a little bit of press because they did something weird to Superman again. It made a little bit of a blip on the news. Most actual regular readers of Superman kind of hated it because he wasn't really Superman anymore. They took away most of his regular powers and they gave him different powers and all of this. So Superman, they're sort of trying to figure out what to do with. We had a number of other things, like Stardust by Gaiman and Vess came out through DC or through Vertigo. We had something called Uncle Sam from Steve Darnell and Alex Ross, which is one of the more sort of brutal comics of the time. It is very, very dark. It is very, very dystopian and distrustful of sort of the American way. And it's weird because it's almost like seeing Alex Ross did the art on it. So it's almost like seeing Norman Rockwell doing some sort of, dystopian paintings or whatever. So
I can't imagine that. Those have got to be some really interesting art in that book.
Yeah, it's good stuff. It's interesting stuff. Very subversive. A guy named Steve Darnell did the story on them. We also got stuff like Transmetropolitan by Ellis and Robertson, also very subversive. I think what you really see is that a lot of what's going on with DC right now is that the early 90s was about dark and gritty, and the late 90s becomes a lot more about just being almost like depressed and aimless. Like there's a lack of confidence in society and social norms that kind of runs through a lot of the 90s stuff coming out of DC and others. History of Violence comes out through DC's Paradox. That's a graphic novel that then gets turned into a movie sometime soon. Kind of an award-winning type of movie. They introduced a lot of things at DC, or worked with a lot of things at DC that tried to subvert or change their core characters. So like Dan Jurgens worked on a new line called Tangent. And what that did was essentially take the Joker and turn the Joker into this female character that was very different from the regular Joker. And all sorts of other characters who were gender swapped, or they were turned into characters with different powers or different origins. kind of to just try and do things differently. And what it really showed was DC was not confident in who their characters were, or that their characters were sort of up to the task of being relevant in the late 90s. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that DC's characters had always been kind of a positive bunch, and they never really did well in the grim and gritty, which is one of the reasons Marvel kind of surpassed them, is Marvel had that going for them. DC had like Lobo and a couple characters they brought in more recently, but Superman and Flash and a lot of these guys, they just didn't really exist in that world. And so probably the most interesting and important book for DC this year was actually Grant Morrison and Howard Porter's JLA. And it was just called JLA, it wasn't called Justice League of America, but it was essentially a reboot of the Justice League that brought the key original 7 Justice Leaguers back, and Morrison sort of returned the Justice League and the DC universe to being kind of that playful, hopeful, adventure-filled place that it had been 20 or more so years ago. So he decided to just do things differently. And it was fantastic. Absolutely amazing. The stories were great. This is one of the first times, but certainly not the last time, that Grant Morrison's going to go through and remake a major franchise. You know, he'll go in and do this with the X-Men later on in the 2000s. A lot of others. There's a lot of times he's gonna come in and make a kind of a rejuvenation. And a lot of times what it comes down to is just going back to the roots of the character and getting rid of a lot of the stuff that's accumulated.
How was it received? I mean, it sounds like it was a really well done series. Was it actually received well then?
Oh yeah, yep. People loved it. It was
That's
something that came in and ran for a long time. They definitely, and in fact, there were a lot of other things then that branched off it. So DC recognized that it was doing well, and they sort of brought in other series to sort of piggyback off it and things like that. But so for DC, I think it was not a great year in terms of, you know, they didn't have that many things other than, I would say, Stardust and JLA are really, you know, lasting contributions to comics. Most of the others were kind of fly-by-night, but they did a lot of stuff. They had, we're going to talk about the fact they had more crossovers with Marvel, all this sort of stuff, and they did manage to retake top position. Now we'll see how long they can hold on to it.
I'm not surprised that it happened, but yet I'm also sort of surprised that it happened, if you know what I mean. Just given how long DC's sort of been the also ran in this in this industry, it does seem wild that they finally overtook him. What about what's going on outside of DC in kind of the rest of the comic industry before we turn our sights more specifically to Marvel?
So there was a lot of interesting stuff going on. We had Ghost World by Daniel Close come out, which is a story of a couple girls kind of trying to navigate kind of that area where you're just starting to grow up. That's turned into a movie. It's actually one of Scarlett Johansson's first movies a few years from now. Steve Ditko does a book called Avenging Tales over at Fantagraphics. It's actually called, I think, Steve Ditko's Avenging Tales. But it's another of the sort of, I wouldn't call it taboo breaking, but Ditko was at a point where he wanted to do political and sort of social and other type of books in a way that it was difficult for him to get regular publishers on board. And so this is one of the last books he does, I think, for a major publisher. And Fantagraphics, even at that, is a little bit smaller and experimental before he goes off and does some things kind of self-published and the like. We had Family Values come out from Frank Miller, another one of his sort of creator-owned type of things. David Finch and Matt Banning bring out Ascension, which is a new series from Top Cow. And then in sort of a little bit odd, almost like a picture book, Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean did a book called The Day I Swapped My Dad for Two Goldfish, which is essentially, I think that got sold in like Scholastic and stuff like this. It's got kind of a children's book feel to it,
Sure.
but obviously it's a weird one. So,
Uh-huh.
and exactly what the title says is kind of what the book's about. So it is crazy. Mike Allred did an interesting book called Red Rocket 7 this year. I liked Mage a lot by Matt Wagner, and the Mage 2 book came out this year. That was actually always a lot of fun. Mage came out very sort of irregularly over the years. You would get some books, and then it would go 5 years or 10 years, and then you'd get some books, but they were always worth it. So there's not a lot of Mage comics out there, but they were actually a lot of fun. He actually did Grendel as well, and Grendel was the same way. You would get a few books here and there, and then you'd wait for a while. Painkiller Jane and a number of other books came out from a new studio called Event Comics, and Painkiller Jane's another one of those. Didn't end up having a lot of issues, but I really liked it when it came out. I think Mark Waid may have been involved in writing it and the like. I think it's owned by Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada, who are the ones who created Event Comics. Okay. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, that they started, and even maybe mention it now. Weird little studio. They created it. A lot of this stuff was IP farmed sort of thing, where I think they were trying to find ways to get movies made and things like this. But they only ended up producing like 50 comic books total. And partly that's because we're going to find out that Palmiotti and Quesada have a major role at Marvel starting up very soon. So they essentially folded up their company to go and do something else with Marvel. A really fun book came out this year called Liberty Meadows by Frank Cho. This is sort of a comic strip style comic about a lady veterinarian and the wacky adventures she has with the sort of animals in her care, and they're anthropomorphic. It's kind of like a sexy Bloom County is probably the best way to describe it. So
quite a description.
I really liked Liberty Meadows. I still go back and read those every once in a while. They're good stuff. And lastly, a really celebrated book called Box Office Poison came out by a guy named Alex Robinson. And this one also is a book that's going to win awards. It's going to still be in print now. So it's really a key title of the late 90s. It's kind of a story that also wraps up in it sort of a critique of comic book industry and things like that.
Gotcha. All right, so that's kind of a high level look at what's going on in the comic book industry. What about like distribution and sales and stuff? What are some of the trends we're seeing there?
So with all this great stuff, there must have been a bunch of comics sold, right? No. It sounds like from what I can find, sales total were down around 25% in 1997 from 1996, which had already been a bad year. And so a lot of comics, like a lot of Image Comics and others, were selling, in some cases, 90% fewer than they used to. And I believe that I saw for some of them the total was closer to like 95 or 97% lower. Goodness. So they'd gone from selling like 100,000 copies to 5,000 copies. Or something along those lines. And evidently only a few dozen comics or comic series for the entire year averaged more than about 5,000 copies a year sold, or 5,000 copies of a title sold. So really just a catastrophic drop compared to, in 92, 93, if you weren't selling at least 120,000 copies, you were in danger of being sort of like canceled because your book wasn't selling well enough. And now there's almost no books in the entire industry in that title.
Your entire line's hopefully doing that, it seems like.
Yeah. It's about right. Sadly, that's about right. So this also hit all publishers and all genres. So not only is it Marvel and DC and the big superhero stuff, but Archie is having problems, and any of the Fantagraphics and some of these the niche presses are having trouble. A lot of your smaller like Bone and Strangers in Paradise and all of these independent books, they're all seeing the problem. And a good part of it is because the entire ecosystem is just shrinking due to all the shops that have closed with bankruptcies. And because there's not as many people selling comics, you just plain don't have as many people having the ability to see them with the eyeballs and buy them. So it's a bad one in terms of that. And we can take a look at beginnings and endings. There were a few brave places coming in. Oni Press got its start with a series called Bad Boy by Frank Miller. They are still going today, have published thousands of comics. Event Comics, like we talked about, got started. Like my notes say, only 43 total comics published by them before they folded. Avatar Press is still out there, I believe. It's published, again, like 1,500 different issues. Top Shelf started up. This is going to be sort of an indie publisher, but they did a lot of really interesting stuff. A lot of them are in different formats, so they're not all actually comic book sized. Some of them are square, or some of them are, tall or sideways or whatever. They were trying to be a little bit more avant-garde in the way they did things.
Okay.
We had Blatant Comics start up. It's basically kind of like a pornography comic publisher of sorts that also did a few other things. So there's always a few of them coming in. And then we had the ones that ended. Milestone Comics had been around for a while in conjunction with DC. They actually folded up this year. That was unfortunate. I think it, among other things, just showed the limits of the industry's reach outside of its core assumed constituency of white males. Because Milestone was a company that targeted black readers, and it looks like the industry just didn't support enough of a black audience that was interested to buy them, and evidently substantial numbers of the white guys out there who were reading comics simply didn't gravitate to Milestone because they looked at it as being for black readers instead. So there was a lot of really good stuff being published by them. They had great creators, but they did not make it. Comico published their last books. I think we talked about this last week, that they were on their last legs. This was actually the year where they finally finished off. Comico is a company that's been around since the 80s, so it's been a long time, and they kind of just didn't make it. Rob Liefeld has a really bad year this year. We're going to see he gets fired from Marvel. He ends up in lawsuits. He has all sorts of things go on. Just a couple of years ago, he got booted out of Image. And now Maximum Press, his main imprint, actually is ended as well. So when Marvel decides that they no longer want him publishing some of their I think it was Fantastic Four or a couple of their books, at that point Maximum Press actually folds up. There's also another company called Big Entertainment, which would put out a number of books that folds. Not a ton of big companies failing this year, but partly that's because there's just so few of them left. Yeah. We are down to about 1/10 of the total publishers now that we would have been at about, say, 5 years ago.
That is actually crazy.
Yep.
You have a note here about a newspaper ad regarding Superman. I'm curious.
There was a guy this year, just as a note, this is just trivia. There's a guy named Mayo Khan who was a bodybuilder sort of guy who evidently took out newspaper ads in preparation, I assume, for some sort of a lawsuit or something, claiming that he was in fact the original model for Superman. And later on, it seems that they've relatively well proven that his either his recollection was simply false or he was making it up. But it does appear that he was actually one of the people who was either like at a theme park or maybe even for Fleischer Studios when they were doing the Superman animated shows in 1940, that he was somebody who there are photos of him back in like 1940 in a Superman costume. So he is probably one of the first people to actually dress up as Superman in a professional role. But he is not one of the first models in terms of, it depends on how you put it, I guess. If he's talking about modeling, modeling the uniform for something or whatever. But yeah, that was a little bit of a kerfuffle where people were trying to figure out exactly what he was up to. But it is interesting that even as far back as 1940s, there, which is only 2-3 years after the character started at all, there were places where you had people essentially playing Superman for kids at theme parks and stuff like this.
Okay, that's an interesting note. Let's move on and let's talk about the Eisner Awards for this year. So obviously they would have come out in 1998 for the books in 1997. What were some of the winners this year?
Astro City won a lot of stuff. It won Best Single Issue. It won Best Continuing Series. For younger kids, the Batman and Robin adventures were really impressive. They won Best Comic Publication, and then also Best, I think there was one other, Best Graphic Album of Batman and Superman Adventures won as well, which is another one of the ones for kids. I think it was interesting that you had a number of things like Castle Waiting by Linda Medley won Best New Series. Best Short Story was a mouthful. It's called the Eltington Comic Book Science Fiction Fantasy Horror and Role-Playing Club in The Marathon Men. And it was in Dork number 4 by Evan Dorkin. So a slave labor book actually won Best Short Story, which I thought was cool. There's a bunch of reprint stuff they're starting to give awards for now, but in terms of the best sort of creators, Garth Ennis won Best Writer for Hitman and Preacher, Unknown Soldier, and Blood Mary Lady Liberty, all working under the DC umbrella. Best Writer Artist, Mike Mignola won for his Hellboy stuff. Best Writer Artist Humor, Jeff Smith won for Bone. And then Best Penciler Inker or Penciler Inker Team, P. Craig Russell on Elric Stormbringer, and Doctor Strange, What Is It That Disturbs You, Stephen? That What Is It That Disturbs You, Stephen is pretty fantastic, by the way. Best Painter, Alec Ross. They should just call it the Alec Ross Award.
Yeah, it seems like that should be like named after him. If it hasn't by now, it probably should be.
Yeah, it maybe is by now. If he painted something that year, he probably wins this. Best Colorist was Chris Ware, coloring his own stuff from Acton Novelty Library. And Best Letterer, our man Todd Klein, for Batman, a bunch of other DC books. So,
I remember right, you were a big fan of Astro City. That was one of your favorites.
I love Astro City. It's fantastic. It deserves all of its awards. Absolutely. Yeah. And
did we get some Hall of Famers this year?
4 of them. And they're very diverse and all very cool and deserving. So Neil Adams, Neil Adams,
yes.
You've read some of his stuff over time. He is one of the greats of the superhero genre from the 60s, 70s. Green Lantern, Green Arrow, Avengers, X-Men. He went on and did his own stuff with continuity. Adams is quite literally a legend, not only for the fact that he's a great artist, but also for the fact that he was kind of very involved in labor relations and getting Siegel and Schuster their due.
Yeah, I remember that.
Organize artists to get their artwork back and all this sort of stuff. We had Archie Goodwin, who was a writer and then also an editor, especially at DC for a long, long time. Very, very respected guy in the industry. He also ran the Epic line for a while, that sort of stuff. Joe Kubert, so cool. They named a school after him. Well, he named a school after him, technically. He founded the Joe Kubert School in a sort of mysterious old mansion and raised an entire generation of students, both literally and figuratively, because he has, I think, 3 or 4 now Kuberts who have come from his family, have continued on the generation as professional artists, and of course he has students all over the place who graduated from the Kubert School. And then lastly, we have Jean Mobius Giraud, Mobius is the crazy character. He's French. He started out doing essentially a Western strip called Blueberry, and then moved into some of the most mind-bending science fiction you can imagine. Stuff like the Inkall and all of this sort of stuff. And he is probably the most influential, at least for modern artists, of all the European artists who have come over in the 60s and 70s, sort of wave of at least European mainland creators. So, yeah, fantastic additions all to the Hall of Fame.
I think I actually recognized all of those names, which is surprising to me because like that means I'm actually right.
Absolutely.
I would not have thought a few years ago you'd tell me these four names and I'd know any of them who you were talking about. But now I do. So that's kind of crazy.
We haven't recounted our origin story in a while. So if for some reason some of you were listening and you didn't join us for Moon Knight or some of these other things, during the pandemic, I talked Dwayne into doing a series on Moon Knight with me. And at that point, he had read no comic books. He was an MCU fan.
Yeah.
And now in the last 4 years, you have read some comic books.
Thousands of comic books, yes. Yes, there's been a lot of it. And,
absolutely. It's been awesome.
I have enjoyed all of it, too. Before we jump into talking about Marvel, though, Dan, what was your favorite non-Marvel comic for 1997?
The JLA books from Morrison. I was really ready for them. I was tired of a lot of the grim stuff. I needed a break and a palate cleanser, and I really enjoyed those. They started out with essentially the first issue is an invasion of Earth that starts as a bunch of aliens coming down and saying, hey, we're going to help everybody. But then it turns out, in actual fact, they're evil Martians, and all hell breaks loose. But it's just a big, bombastic, adventurous, world-spanning story. It's great time.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I'd have to look into that. All right, I think we've covered comics as a whole. Let's jump in and let's talk more specifically about what the year was like for Marvel. The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
Okay. Marvel, 1997. Bankruptcy at the end of the year. They've now lost the number one spot in comic book sales this year. What's going on? Where do we begin when we talk about what Marvel was doing this year?
It was a rough year to be Marvel, man. The line for them continued to shrink. Sales plummeted. Fewer and fewer series seemed to last more than a few issues. Big series had largely ended, so they were kind of trying some new things. And both their sticker company and their distribution company that they had so proudly purchased just a few years ago had to be shuffled off to get them out of financial distress by the end of the year. So,
yikes. Yeah. That's not good. That's not good at all.
Breaking up the band.
All right.
In actual fact, by the way, it's really good because deciding to focus on what they do best instead of just screwing everybody up with other stuff was the right thing to do, but the right thing would have been to do not buy a sticker company and a distribution hub in the first place.
Yes. Yes.
Mistakes were made.
All right. So, new comics series is this year. What sort of number are we talking here?
So, total series this year, including one-shots and everything else, 179.
And we were talking like over 300 just a couple of years ago.
I think 3 years ago it was almost 350. So it's basically the line is cut in half from what it was about 3 years ago. Because it went from 350 down to 325, down to 275 or something last year, and then this year right off the cliff.
Yeah, so that is a stark difference from a couple of years ago.
Yep. Right, and a lot of these are not series either. They are one-shots.
Right. Okay, so I'll break that down for us. What are we talking? New series versus one-shots?
So we have 120 new series and 126 series ending. and almost all of them are the same. So there's probably 60 some one shots that basically the first and the last issue are the same issue. And then there's collected editions where also there's maybe one or maybe two books. I think that overall you're talking something like 100 of these are single issue type things. So there's only really 50 or 60 ongoing titles or even ongoing miniseries in the Marvel stable in 1997.
Yeah. So, what was the best-selling comic this year? Then?
For them, their best-selling comic was Uncanny X-Men number 345, and then Heroes Reborn number 1 also sold well. Neither of them, for the first time in a lot of time, Marvel did not have the top-selling comic, though. Usually they had a couple times Image had taken it away, but actually Darkness number 11 took the number 1 comic spot this year from Top Cow. I think it's Top Cow, but they had like 9 covers and somehow managed to convince people to buy all of them.
Get a bunch of copies.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So assuming they're still having like big events and things this year within the comics themselves, what are we talking when it comes to that?
They had a couple big events. There was, first off, Operation Zero Tolerance, and that's going to be a big crossover that mostly goes again through the mutant universe. We'll talk about that in a little while. We've got Unlimited Access with DC, which is something that, again, there's an awful lot of crossovers going on, and this is sort of an amalgam crossover. So that's another one that they're kind of doing a joint production with DC. And then we have Heroes Reborn, The Return, which comes out near the end of the year.
That has to be the return of all those heroes that Onslaught took care of just a year or so ago.
That have been hanging out in a pocket universe doing their own thing for a year, while, as we can see when we're talking about Daredevil, the rest of the Marvel Universe tries to somehow deal with the fact that they're all gone. And then the last one, which is going to factor in our spotlight this month, is the flashback month, which is when 25 or 26 Marvel titles, instead of having their regularly numbered title for the month, they had a -1 issue. And the -1 issue was out of continuity, and it was just its own sort of old thing. Which, just as a note, they're kind of fun. I think you enjoyed. I think I enjoyed the Daredevil one.
Yeah.
According to one of the sources that I've been reading, the American Comic Book Chronicles, it's one of the worst received sort of little ideas that Marvel had in a decade.
Oh, wow.
Nobody bought this thing. And it made the month that they did the flashback thing one of the lowest selling months total in terms of units in like 15 or 10 years for comic books.
Oh no. When you're already struggling to have like this idea and have it land so horribly bad that this basically craters the already, microscopic sort of selling that you've been doing compared to a few years ago, that can't be good.
It's bad for everybody. So yeah.
All right. So let's talk about the things that happened in a little bit more detail. Where do we begin with regards to? I guess we could talk about like them selling off the distribution company and the sticker company that you mentioned during the intro.
Well, those actually come at very different times, so we'll get to them separately because right at the beginning of the year is when Heroes World Distributing gets closed, and they can't even sell it off. They just close it. So they bought this big thing, and then they just basically close it because what they found is that nobody really wanted to have another distribution center like this. Diamond already had everybody else, so they just closed Heroes World Distributing and began distributing through Diamond, making them, in effect, a distribution monopoly, which is bad because monopolies, but in actual fact, for the comic industry at that time, it became incredibly important and useful. Because what happened is the remaining retailers had been crushed by the fact that they were having a terrible time getting their books, getting any kind of terms for credit on their books, anything like that. And by just having Diamond take over with everything, you now had just one distributor to work with. A lot of these guys just sort of needed the stability of that. So at this time, while Diamond has been, much maligned over the years for being a monopoly and all the rest, pretty much everybody welcomed this in '97 because the industry was just in a situation where it needed stability. And so Marvel moving to Diamond gave everybody a bit of stability. You could order everything out of one place. You paid one set of shipping costs. Everything else, it really helped to keep the boat from sinking any further.
Yeah, with this move of distribution from their own to Diamond, did this cause any hiccups with regards to publishing at all?
Does not appear so. Everything continued. You still had that 3-month lead time, so they'd have been able to figure out what they're doing and the like. So did not miss a month of publishing at any point during the change of distributor or going through bankruptcy or any of that. Comics continued to make the shelves for Marvel the entire way through, which people were not exactly sure was going to happen. Nobody knew when their last Marvel comic was coming in '97 because the news coming out about the company was pretty dark. They were 500 to $1 billion in debt, and nobody knew exactly how that was going to work out. You had billionaires fighting over it all through the summer and all of that. So while we're talking about any of this other stuff, that cloud kind of hangs over things.
Okay. So what else is going on then?
Well, this is that year of the Pocket Universe, the Heroes Reborn Pocket Universe. So essentially the Fantastic Four is gone, Cap is gone, the Avengers are gone. And as we even see in Daredevil this year, that means that Daredevil is now taking on people like the Absorbing Man, who in actual fact is well above his weight class. But a lot of these street-level heroes are now sort of having to take on higher levels of threat because there's nobody else in New York to do it, essentially. And then we also see Black Widow is affected by this in terms of trying to find ways to get things, sort of stabilized. And so this ends at the very end of the year. Liefeld actually gets replaced in Captain America and Avengers by Jim Lee's studio midway through the year. He then retaliated by making his own, what he calls Fighting American comics. He licensed an old character that had also been created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who was basically another Captain America.
Oh, jeez.
And then took all of the scripts he was going to use for his Captain America going forward and reworked them into this character and published them. And got these out in '97, actually. So he was a very busy fellow.
Yeah.
Marvel sued. A judge decided that there were things that had to be done or whatever, but he did get to publish his comics. He was a very spiteful fellow, our man Liefeld. He was not happy. But at the end of the year, though, Franklin Richards actually in this Heroes Reborn, we find out that he is the one who put all of the heroes into the Pocket Universe, and he actually helps to return them. And as of the end of the year, the heroes are returned, but they haven't got their new books back yet. So essentially, all of the existing Captain America, Avengers, whatever, they'll run 13 issues, they'll be canceled. There's a 4-issue, one issue a week series that brings them back out of the Pocket Universe, and then we'll see that the January labeled titles will be when, like, Iron Man #1, Avengers #1, Fantastic Four #1 come back out.
They're all restarted again then.
They'll all be restarted again in the new timeline or the new world that we'll talk about in 1998.
Okay. So did they have issues where you saw what happened in the Pocket Universe?
Yeah, the whole year. Okay. That is the Pocket Universe.
Those are those like limited series that went on after the Onslaught event and before this Reborn event. Okay.
So like essentially Avengers, had gone for 350 issues or whatever. It was canceled. They started again with a volume 2 that's going to last 13 issues. And those 13 issues don't technically exist in the Marvel Universe because they're in Franklin Richards' Pocket Universe. We just didn't really know what was going on with where they were at. We knew they were in a different place, but we didn't know what was going on until the Reborn came, and then they all kind of pile on back into the regular universe, and we start up again. So technically, those stories are in chronology for the characters, but not for the cities and towns.
Not for the 616 Earth. Basically.
Yep.
Okay.
So there's a year of Daredevil's life where there are no Avengers in town.
Yes.
So.
Okay, that's a little trying to wrap my head around it. Trying to wrap my head around it. Let's talk about Operation Zero Tolerance. What is you mentioned that as kind of the mutant event that occurred this year. What's that?
Yep, as usual, mutants are hated because of something that happens, right? So there's a murder of a politician, or the supposed murder of a politician by a mutant, and then this Operation Zero Tolerance, run by a new character called Bastion, comes out, and it is attempting to round up the mutants and the like. You see some of this actually again in Daredevil, where there's a time when somebody asks about Matt Murdock in any case ends up defending the rights of a mutant, and everybody else is like, it's not a good time to do that right now, they're not very popular, and he's like, well, it doesn't really matter if they're popular, they're still, they deserve to be treated decently or whatever. So it was another bad year for the mutants, but almost every year there's a crossover where the mutants are hated and hunted down by humanity.
Sure.
So, Spider-Man is kind of lost this year. He's now back. The clone is gone, but he's not working at the paper anymore. He's doing other things. He's essentially like teaching and stuff like this, I think. And a lot of people are starting to get a little bit disgruntled with the Spider-Man state right now. This is, he's married and he's kind of wandering around doing other things, and this is where they start to think that maybe Spider-Man's got to have a reboot of some sort, because sales and the like are really not good right now. So one other thing, though, you may have heard about this little thing called Thunderbolts. It's been in the news a bit, right? So
they are
movie coming out.
Yeah, they're getting an MCU debut here, not too distant a future.
So the Thunderbolts debuted this year. 1997 was their beginning. And it was kind of cool because it actually fits in and makes sense. So the reason why the Thunderbolts debuted in 97, where they got the idea for it, is you remember the Avengers are gone. Daredevil's trying to step up. But there's this hole, kind of this power vacuum. So a bunch of the villains are like, hey, how about we pretend to be heroes and we kind of move in on the hero's territory, and then once everybody starts to trust us, we'll do the heel turn and we will just take them to the cleaners and take over the world or whatever.
Sure.
Right?
That makes a lot of sense. That's a good plan, actually.
Yep. So now normally we just think about the Thunderbolts as being like this team of bad guys that pretend to be heroes, but it really made sense in 97 because there was this Avengers power vacuum. The main thing about it that is interesting in terms of the way they wanted to do it was, even then in 97, the internet had become a pretty quick way of information getting out to people.
Yeah.
And they wanted to keep secret the fact that at the end of the first issue, they were going to sort of break this secret. So Thunderbolts, and this was against the best wishes of a lot of the people in marketing, Thunderbolts was marketed as just a new superhero team. And they took all of the villains like Baron Zemo and people like this, and they gave them new character costumes and identities. And so when you bought Thunderbolts #1, you thought you were getting a new superhero team. And it's only when you get to like the last page or two of that issue that you find out that in fact it's you get sort of the turn. And
Really?
so it was wildly, not marketed the way that you would market something these days. They would give that away to try and interest people. But Marvel, the creators were adamant that they wanted to give readers who bought the copy this little Easter egg sort of, surprise. And they did it. Evidently, there was no marketing or anything that gave it away. And so this was a genuine sort of like, surprise development in the comic world, which is almost impossible to even imagine happening these days because somebody's always giving something away.
No, that definitely does not feel like that could be possible these days.
There you go. And that gets us to the end of the year. And so this is when, nearing in September, Marvel actually is going through all of this in Chapter 11 stuff. Perlman had actually filed for bankruptcy for Chapter 11 protection without shareholder consent back in 1996. And the reason was he wanted to retain control of the company while figuring out whatever he needed to, right? Well, Icon, the other billionaire involved, didn't like that idea because he wanted to get control, especially of a lot of the movie rights. And then you also had the Toy Biz folks, Perlmutter and Avi Arad. In the end, Icon and Perlman basically killed each other in terms of taking over the company. And when they fell over with each other's swords in their bellies, Perlmutter and Arad just sort of ended up taking over Marvel.
Wow.
And so if you ever see like any of the X-Men movies or a lot of this sort of stuff, Avi Arad is the name that's on as producer on almost all of that early stuff. And that's because he then took over doing a lot of the development stuff and things like that and negotiated a lot of the contracts, which we're going to find are terrible contracts, by the way.
Oh, great.
Marvel is now in a situation where they've sold off Panini because they have to sell that off in September to pay off some of their debts. They have agreed to pay $385 million cash to their various creditors. So they then have to go into various places and sell off what they can. And they sell off Panini. They sell off some other stuff. What's the other thing they can sell to get quick cash? The rights to their characters for movies and TV and that sort of stuff. So this is where, over the next couple of years, you're going to see all of Marvel's main characters licensed out on contract terms that mean the company makes almost no money whatsoever when the movies come out.
Is this how Sony was able to license Spider-Man?
This is how Sony gets Spider-Man and why Sony has such a great deal with Spider-Man that they never wanted to give it back. Terrible contracts coming. Not this year, but we'll see those terrible contracts coming here as Marvel still tries to get their way out of bankruptcy. But so it's at the end of the year that essentially Perlman and Icon wander out, and then Perlmutter and Arad come in. And that's the other weird thing, is that the two guys, for whatever reason, have almost the same name. So keep in mind, the guy who filed for bankruptcy and now is out is Ike Perlman. And the guy who's from Toy Biz who's coming in with Arad is Isaac Perlmutter.
Very close. Very close.
So, there you go.
All right, so let's talk about new series then. There seems like there was a few. We talked about Thunderbolts. That seems like that was probably the most successful one.
Yep. Thunderbolts went for 81 issues and has been around in one form or another ever since as a part of the Marvel Universe. Extremely successful. Deadpool also. He debuted a few years ago in New Mutants. He'd had a couple of miniseries. He now gets his own ongoing. That goes for 70 issues, which in the late 90s, early 2000s, these are both fantastic runs.
Yeah.
We then get Spider-Man the manga, which goes for 31 issues. which is kind of cool. Kazar goes for 20 issues, as well as Alpha Flight. And that I'm a big Alpha Flight fan, so I enjoyed that. I think this is version 3, volume 3 of Alpha Flight. Heroes for Hire went 19 issues. Marvel Adventures is kind of a kid's one that went for 18. Star Trek Early Voyages for 17. And then we have a bunch of them that kind of last a year or less. Quicksilver, Maverick, and Marvel Team Up all last about a year. So it's, considering where they're at, it's not a terrible launch. Having 2 books that last 5 or 6 years is a pretty good start for a year. But when you look at the total number of new series and how many of them even were trying to be ongoings, it was pretty dark nonetheless.
What about notable limited series? Was there any that stood out, maybe that were either the one shots or the short series?
Yeah. So Spider-Man the manga, I think, was supposed to be a limited series originally, and immediately or soon got upped to ongoing. But Iron Lantern, Lobo the Duck, The Magnetic Men, Exciting X-Patrol, all of these are more of those amalgam books with DC. So like Lobo the Duck is Lobo and Howard the Duck merged into one kind of idea and then given his own story. Most of those were one-shots. The Squadron Supreme graphic novel we've been talking about for a long time actually came out this year. It's the one that had Mark Grenwald in it, literally. So this is the one where he died and had his ashes put in.
Yeah.
Heroes Reborn and Return, we talked about that. That's a 4-issue series that sets the stage for next year. And then those 66 one-shots. Some of them were annuals, some of them were amalgam books, some of them were crossovers. A lot of them were licensed books like Star Trek and the like. And one of them was even a Clueless adaptation. So
like
if you remember
the movie Clueless, with
like the Alicia Silverstone Clueless.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
There's a comic book for that, astonishingly, from Marvel.
I can't even imagine what that is like. But
No, I don't know how that happened, but there you go.
New characters this year.
We got the Thunderbolts and all of their various alter egos, and really, it's kind of sketchy because most of them are, in actual fact, established characters like Nemo who just got new character names, and then they take those suits off at the end, so most of them didn't stick around. I think the biggest actual character this year is one everybody knows because of the movies and the like, is Blind Al. So Deadpool's sassy, potty-mouthed roommate appears for the first time actually in this year, in that new Deadpool series. Also a character called T-Ray who's going to be recurring for him. Other than that, we had Carrion, Hunger, Kangaroo, Maggot, Murmur, and White Tiger 2. I don't know of much else.
Those aren't real.
It's not a great year.
No. To put it mildly.
Kangaroo makes the top 10 for new characters this year for Marvel. So that can't be good. Anyway,
so
best to just move on from there.
Yeah. So let's talk about series that ended this year that were probably ongoing going into this year. Where they're obviously we're not going to have like the Avengers or X-Men that went some 300 issues and got ended like they did last year. When everything's kind of got turned upside down by the events of what's going on at Marvel, plus the event, the big crossover Onslaught event that occurred.
Yep.
What are we talking as far as books that ended this year? Is there anything of any real consequence or note that you would want to highlight?
I think the main thing is, like you said, they've already killed most of the long-running titles. So there's not anything that had been going a long time. But Untold Tales of Spider-Man had gone 26 issues. It got canceled. Spider-Man Magazine, 19 issues, had gotten canceled. Professor Xavier and the X-Men, 18. Punisher, 18. Really the big thing to me, because, like Iron Man, Captain America, Avengers, Fantastic Four, all of them got canceled at 13 issues because that was the plan, sort of.
Right.
But when you look at it, Untold Tales of Spider-Man, Spider-Man Magazine, Adventures of Spider-Man, Untold Tales of Spider-Man, Spider-Man Team Up, of the 20 books that got canceled that had ran 5 or more issues, a quarter of them were Spider-Man books. So I think it shows to that whole softness of people are just not, they don't know what's going on with Spider-Man right now. They're not doing a good job with Spider-Man right now. And people are, Spider-Man books do not get canceled at Marvel.
Yeah.
There's just always another one, pretty much.
Right.
So to have 5 of them gone in a year is pretty crazy.
That is shocking, actually. It seemed like when in doubt, put another Spider-Man book out and it would just sell. And it seems as though there's been a saturation point and probably more appropriately, there was probably some content within those books that just wasn't resonating anymore. And so they had to put an end to them.
Astonishingly, there evidently is a limit. But I think that, they just had started to get to a point where people just were not resonating with the character. And it probably had to do, that whole clone event where they made Peter Parker not actually the original Spider-Man. He was the clone. They did a bunch of stuff that was pretty questionable. And maybe it just kind of came back to haunt them this year.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about the bullpen then. I don't even know what to think about what the bullpen probably looks like at this point. Did we have a lot of people with getting creator credits this year?
Yeah. So the staff size this year is 573. And if you remember, just like, 3-4 years ago, we were at 879 or something. So you've got a substantial decrease. And again, a lot of those also are decreases in full-time staffers and the like, going to now being folks who are just contractors from Maximum or contractors from Jim Lee's studio, that sort of stuff. I tried to compute the new staff, and it's hopeless at this point because you have so many people like Gene Colan, right, who's been gone for years, who now comes back. It's become kind of a rotating door. So computing who's actually new, I'm going to have to need a new, essentially a new query, because there's just too many people who have been gone for years from Marvel who now bounce back and are doing other things.
Not that we had any problem seeing Gene Colan on some Daredevil books this year.
Was that not fantastic?
Just to point that out. Did
God,
you have any?
Fantastic.
Did you have any notable passings this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Marvel fans, there's one person we want to remember: Billy Graham, not the televangelist, just as a note,
Sure.
but instead the fantastic comic book artist. He worked on Luke Cage, Black Panther. He was with McGregor on like the Panther's Rage run, that sort of stuff. It's one of the sort of few really regular black comic artists of the 60s and 70s. It was one of a relatively low number of black comic artists working in comics in the 70s and into the 80s. And I really enjoyed his work. It was very kinetic and sort of elongated figures and like, he was kind of like his figures looked like wiry Jack Kirby figures, kind of. But it was really great stuff. If you ever get a chance to read a Billy Graham book, I would highly recommend doing it. But he passed away at age 61 in 97. So.
All right. Before we get to your favorite Marvel book from 1997, let's talk about the Rookie of the Year this year. Were there many in consideration, and who ends up taking home the prize?
So there are a number of people who came in who could have potentially been considered, but I think in the end I just have one runner-up and then the winner. Ed McGuinness I put as the runner-up. He has done a lot of great comic book art. Started actually this year on Deadpool, and he also worked for Marvel on Avengers. He worked on the Hulk. A lot of his best stuff, in my opinion, was done over at DC though, because he had a number of fantastic runs on Superman, And really, in many ways, he's kind of a definitive Superman artist of the late 90s, early 2000s. So, nonetheless, he did do a lot of nice work at Marvel as well, and is somebody who definitely, should be considered. I think, though, the winner is somebody who, again, you liked the art of back when we were reading some of this stuff. His name's Lionel Francis Yu, and he started out doing a lot of Wolverine stuff. He moved on to doing the New Avengers and the Secret Invasion event. He's been on X-Men. He is a Filipino artist who broke in and sort of started working a lot with Brian Michael Bendis. He's also done some cool X-Men stuff with Hickman. Really just has had a nice body of work for Marvel. And there was also a time, I would say, in the late 2000s where his work becomes sort of the go-to for Marvel. Like a lot of, Marvel's got a big thing that they're doing. There's a good chance that he's going to be involved in it at that point. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
You have here that they created the Wave character too?
Yeah, actually, just as another note, that is, there's not a lot of characters really that he's got a co-creator or whatever on. I think we see that more and more with the new creators, because if they've got somebody cool, they're going to bring it into their own book, not give it to Marvel, right? But he did create a character called Wave, who is one of the first, if not the first, Filipino superhero or superheroine. And so yeah, been doing some stuff for a number of years for other companies and the like too. But I think he's a good choice for his body of work at Marvel as well.
Good choice. I do remember liking the art in some of the books that we looked at while we were doing the comic books and then watching the MCU property. Congratulations. Dan, as we're wrapping things up, what was your favorite Marvel comic for 1997?
It was, in fact, the one we're going to be talking about next week. I liked the Daredevil books. I returned to them because Colin was on them, and I really enjoyed them. I think that this was really probably one of the class of Marvel books for 97. So, yeah. Go with my old friend Hornhead. So,
nothing wrong with that. We could definitely take
there is
that.
Not.
There is. It is an interesting year for Daredevil. We're going to have a lot to talk about next week when we talk about it. There's like we mentioned, we had Gene Gold return to Daredevil for the first time in years, like decade, more than a decade.
Yep.
And
right.
Al Williamson came back on inks as well. It was like sort of getting the creative band back together a little bit with some of the artists and that. And I mean, we had a pretty consistent writing staff as well. We had just a couple of people there, and I think the books were just solid throughout the year. So we definitely will have something to talk about.
Absolutely.
All right, but for now, that's going to wrap it up for us for this week. We'd like to thank you all for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. But if you're already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help other new listeners find the show that much easier. Now, whether you've been with the podcast from the beginning or you're just joining us now, we'd love to get your thoughts on this week's show. You can send us those thoughts via email. That address is comments@comicsovertime.com, or you can reach out via social media. We're on Twitter or X or Blue Sky or whatever @comicsovertime. All right, Dan, I think we got through talking about what happened in comics in 1997. It wasn't quite as bad as 96 as far as what we talked about, but it does seem like there was it definitely felt like it might have been worse to your point.
Yeah.
But I think getting to the second half of this discussion and talking about Daredevil will make I think I'll feel a little bit better, and I hope you as a listener get to feel better as well.
There you go.
Until next week, take care, everybody.
All right. See you later, folks.